Talking sexy, talking self-care. It's your sexy self-care, sexy self-care. Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of My Sexy Self-Care. I am your host, Grant Rosenquist, and on this podcast, we talk about modern-day sexuality, the tools I have learned that work for me, and all things sex positive. And just a reminder, sex positivity is really the concept that says, I wish I had more sex and intimacy in my life with more people. And I want to encourage other people, men, women, family members, the world, to be having more sex with more people too. And when you take the principles of consent between two people or the parties involved, and you take the principle of being open with your intentions, it allows the framework for all of us to start enjoying that more. And today on the podcast, we'll be talking a little bit about porn for women. We'll be talking about using vanity as a tool for your health. We're going to be talking about the spiritual practice of becoming trans. We're also going to be talking about toxic femininity. And we're going to be asking ourselves, is genital mutilation serving your child? And that's a question I think a lot of us don't even think to ask. And as always, we'll be recapping with the alternative reality. So let's get started with a little porn positivity. Porn positivity, loving myself physically. Forget about the judgment and the shame. For me, it's porn positivity to love myself emotionally and learn to use the tools that work for me. With my own sexuality, the only consent I need is me. So you do you and I'll do me, and let's do our best to not feel icky. So in this life, whatever you do, use the positivity of porn to work for you. All right, hello. And on this segment of porn positivity, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my journey of doing this, right? So, like I mentioned before, my intention to create porn is initially for me to really prove to myself as a mental exercise that I don't need to be shameful about my sexuality. So much so that I'm going to prove it to myself by putting content out on the internet for the world to see, right? And since that's going to be my mental exercise, I asked myself, well, okay, now that you're going to do this, what kind of content do you want to create, right? And I think to myself that a couple things is most of the porn that you see is porn made for men. But there are a lot of new channels and a lot of new different creators that are trying to cater more towards the feminine audience, right? And 1/3 of all the viewership of porn is women, right? Even though I think 98% of the content is really made for the male perspective. And so I want to encourage the other 15% of the women to feel less shame to watch porn and give the 33% of the audience of porn, who are women, more content that might be nuanced for them, right? And one reason you can tell that porn is actually made from the male perspective, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's plenty of women in porn, but if that's the paradigm we've always kind of used, it makes sense that most creators are going to use that paradigm. So, but the way you could kind of tell that it's really made for men in the male perspective is because one of the types of porn I enjoy watching is POV porn, meaning point of view, where the camera is really on the male, like their forehead. So the content is shot from first person perspective, right? As they're sharing energy with the female model. There is also POV porn from gay men, which shows that same point of view with the other male model. But there's very little, I can hardly find any content of POV porn made for women where the camera is on the female model looking at the male model as they share sexual energy. And yes, I understand how vulnerable that will be when the camera of the model I'm working with is right in front of me, right? Recording everything I'm doing. Well, that is also my way of not being ashamed to be vulnerable in front of the camera. And that is what I'm hoping will be quality content. So I'm still looking for models that want to collaborate and work with me in that form or these other ideas I'm creating. So if you are an adult content maker and are interested in collaborating, hit me up, mysexyselfcare@gmail.com, and we can talk about it. And you know, I have a new segment that we're going to go to called The Toolbox of Life. And where this segment kind of evolved from is I was doing a mushroom trip that was pretty deep. And it was one of the ones I did early on. And it made me realize that sometimes it's good to take the perspective that everything in your life is a tool, from the people you surround yourself with, to the people you engage with, to the music you listen to the content you watch on the screen of your phone, right? To your environment, to your space, to your pets, to everything. If you can take the perspective that everything in your life is a tool, then what you can do is it helps you understand, hey, given the fact I have these goals, are these tools helping me achieve that or hindering me from it, right? And sometimes it's good when you don't know what direction you should be taking is to think of everything in your life as a tool, right? Well, that is where this segment comes from, called The Toolbox of Life.
Grant, remember to use your tools.
Drop that shit.
It's the New Year's, and a lot of people are talking about New Year's resolutions, and I don't really practice resolutions per se anymore, but I definitely use this time to reevaluate the values that my personal values that I'd like to continue or double down on for the new year. A reason I don't really use resolutions anymore is I realized I don't really ever do anything I don't want to do. So with resolutions, I think by definition, they're usually something you don't want to do. By definition, you're kind of telling yourself, well, once January 1st comes, then I'm going to do this thing that I didn't do prior to January 1st. And that kind of inherently means you don't want to do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have waited for January 1st to roll around. So some of the tools I use are different than that, right? Just to give you an example, I used to weigh almost 300 pounds, and I used to go to the gym. I used to have New Year's resolutions twice a month. when I'm trying to go to the gym and this time I mean it, I'm going to stick with it. And then I would, fall off the wagon and then wait, and then get upset at myself and then go back and say, this time I mean it. Well, I realized that tool wasn't working. So I was also using the metric of my weight as a motivator, which also didn't help, right? So just to give you a little idea, what I did, or what I'm still working on, is finding things that I would do anyway, even if they didn't have a physical benefit to it. If they didn't create exercise for me, and I would still do it. So to give you an example is, I love paddleboarding. When it's the summertime, I go down the river at least 3 days a week, and I enjoy that nature. I smoke some weed. I listen to music. I would do that if it had no physical benefit, but it does. And I use it for a workout when I go by myself, and I use that for a workout. And it just so happens that the side effect is exercise. Another is downhill skiing. I got a season pass, and I'll go up, enjoy the ride up there and the sunrise and the fresh snow and the crisp air, and hauling ass down the hill, right? And I would do that even if it didn't have a physical benefit, but it does, right? Another one is sex. Like, one of my values that I'm reaffirming this year is to make sexuality a larger part of my days. So, I enjoy sex with my partners, with friends, with even people I don't know very well. I enjoy all of it. And I want to have sexuality as a larger part of the day, the hours of my day. And guess what? A side effect of that is it has great physical benefits to it, and mental benefits too. But those are just tools I've learned how to do instead, because I'm learning most of the times the things you trying to do, you need to want to do it. So you have to figure out different and creative ways of achieving it, right? Another tool I use for New Year's resolution is, I don't look at the short term, I look at the long term, because I am 45 years old. I will be 46 this year. And when I am 60 or 65, I want to be a smoking hot 65-year-old, right? I want to be ripped. I want to have tattoos. I don't actually have any tattoos right now. I want to be healthy in mind and body, right? Just like you would see in these, advertisements for older, sexy men, right? So the way I'm going to get there is make sure that as long as I'm working out and exercising more this year than I did last year, then I'm making steps to accomplish that, right? I have a long way to go. I do a lot of cardio, but I need a lot more muscle building. But as long as I work out more this year than I did last year, I'm achieving that, and I'm creating habits, right? So even if I fall off the wagon, I have to get back on the horse after a couple of weeks. Like, I haven't ran for a month, I haven't done exercise, or even if it's daily, as long as my annual workouts are larger, then I'm making steps to get that. And that's how it's been for the last 5 years, right? So I've been increasingly getting healthier and increasingly getting more physically attractive. I also using vanity as the tool, right? If I'm a fucking smoking hot 65-year-old guy who's ripped and has tattoos, guess what? A side effect of that is my health is going to be pretty fucking good, right? So I'm using vanity because I have a lot more ability to want to look good than just be healthy, right? So I'm using that tool as well. So this is a good idea of really looking at your toolbox, right? And realize you can't use one tool right? Your mind is so smart that you need to figure out multiple tools and use many tools to accomplish the goal. You can't just change one thing. You can't just be like, man, I never make it to the gym and this year I'm going to mean it, right? That is one tool, and it's a tool that you've used before and you're expecting a different result from the results you've gotten in the past, right? Well, that pattern is also a tool to identify yourself. We shouldn't do that anymore. We shouldn't use the same tools and expect a different result when we're not getting them, right? So yeah, I use the New Year's to help reassert my values, right? Reassert, hey, I'm trying to enjoy the passing of time and figuring out what that means. I am trying to remove negative people out of my life, right? I'm trying to increase the amount of sexuality that is in my days from every day, right? So those are some of my values that I'm trying to reinforce. And, they talked about 2023 being the year of the awakening, like almost a spiritual awakening or a mental awakening. And what that means to me is, the realization that your mind is really a computer, right? Your mind is a computer that has been programmed. It's been programmed mostly by what we're taught, by our environment, and also by our genetics, right? So understanding your thoughts and your emotions are a reflection of your experiences and your genetics, right? It's a combination of all these things, but it's also it's awareness. It's awareness that this is going on. And the more you become self-aware, that was, I think, representing what awakening is, right? And it's all different to anybody. Everything's different to everybody. And the level of awareness is continual, right? So it's not like you just are awake and like, oh, this is what's going on. It's a continual process to understand what that means, right? Well, for me, I'm going to brand 2024 as the reprogramming, right? Because I think understanding that your mind is basically a computer that creates emotions and reactions based on patterns of how you grew up, patterns of how you cope, patterns of how you survive, and patterns of what you think is the goals are supposed to be. Well, one thing to become as you're becoming aware is to realize that not only are you a computer, but you are also have the ability to program. You actually, it's like part of the awakening, I think, or the awareness is realizing, oh, I know why I'm that way. I know that when I reacted this way because when I was a child, this happened, and this is my way. That was my way to cope, and I'm using those ways now. When this other thing happens, that reminds me of that. Right? That's just a little example of learning how to become self-aware. But the second step to that is realizing, oh, I understand how I am, but I don't need to be that way in the future. I can reprogram my brain. I can reprogram my habits. I can reprogram the way I want to feel. I could reprogram the way I want to think. I could reprogram what the goals are or what I want them to be. I could reprogram the problems, right? So for me, 2024 is going to represent, how do I want to reprogram my mind? What do I want it to do? How do I want it to feel, right? It's good to really understand both of these things, like where your thoughts and feelings come from, how they got there, but also how you want them to be. Understand that just because things are doesn't mean that's how they need to be. Just because you always think negatively doesn't mean you can't become the most optimistic person you've ever met, right? But also, so much of our own self-talk is the program we're running, right? you can have two different people. And imagine a child growing up in an environment surrounded by a large family, and with every aspiration this child has, the family just will maybe have a negative response to it, right? Imagine a child's like, I want to be a pilot when I grow up, and then you imagine like a whole family. Why would you want to do that? Why you want to leave your family? Why would you why would you want to set yourself up for disappointment? Why don't you be realistic, right? Why don't you not have that dream, right? Well, imagine a family that has just been taught themselves that's how to think. That child grows up in the environment, and that becomes their own self-talk in their head. When someone says, man, do you think I can get that job? Do you think I could learn how to be that person? And then their own self-talk's like, well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to set yourself up for disappointment? Why would you want to disappoint others? Why do you think you're smart enough to do that? Right? All that self-talk comes from the programming when we were a child, right? And that a child from a different family, imagine if you could create a family that when the child's like, I want to be a pilot when I grow up, that the family, different people in the family, like, why stop at being a pilot? Why not be an astronaut? Why not start learning about that right now? What's stopping you from achieving that right now? Like, is that really what you want to do? What's it going to take to get there? What do you think you have to learn how to do to become that? Right? If there was a family using those thoughts, that becomes a child's self-talk. So when that child becomes 40 and it's like, I want to change careers, I want to do something completely different, his own self-talk's like, well, why can't I? What's stopping me? How do I achieve this, right? Though that self-talk, the self-talk you have in your mind is your own default program running from how you were taught to think as a child. Well, just because you have negative self-talk or self-talk that just tells you like, oh, you can't do that, or why would you do that? Maybe you fear failure, you fear disappointing other people. Well, that may all be true, and it's good to understand where that comes from. It's good to dissect that and understand where that all comes from, but it's also very good to understand, well, how do I fucking want to think? What if I got to change all that? What if I could? What if I could figure out a way to change my own self-talk? To change my own self-talk to give me confidence that I can do anything, that no matter what the problem is, I don't run through all the scenarios of what disasters may happen. Instead, I use the tool to say, you know what, you're a pretty smart motherfucker, and regardless of the scenarios that you can't even foresee, you will figure it out, right? I feel like that's advanced thinking. It's like your mind's like, I'm running through 100 scenarios of the worst possible scenarios, and it makes me fearful, right? Well, truth is, you're better off programming a computer or your own mind to realize you're not going to be able to think of all the scenarios that could go wrong, but you're actually a very smart and resourceful person. And regardless of the problems you can't even foresee, you will be able to figure out when it happens, right? So learning how to reprogram the way you think and feel, to me, is what 2024 is going to represent. And maybe you have no idea what that means or how to figure it out. But what is most important is realizing you have the ability to. You have the ability to change your mind any way you want. And a little evidence of this is, even people say, well, I'm genetically can't do that. I can't do that. Like my genetics won't allow me to. That's just how it is, right? Well, even things we are genetically programmed to do or facilitate with, you can the power of your mind has the ability to override those. Let me give you a couple examples. So if most people, if their heartbeat slowed to 5 beats per minute, it would instantly go into cardiac arrest and they would die, right? Well, there are people who can meditate and train their mind to lower their heartbeats to only a few beats a minute, right? Well, that is something we are genetically not programmed to do, right? Another example is freedivers. If I held my breath for probably 4 minutes, I would probably pass out. And if it was still held, I would die, right? Well, freedivers have trained their minds and body with practice to be able to hold their breath for 10 minutes plus, right? That is something that we were not genetically programmed to be able to do. But the power of your mind has the ability to override anything genetically, right? I hesitate, like I stop there because it's like if someone's like, well, Grant, I have a genetic disease, whatever it is, I want to say, well, obviously there's some things that can't, but then also part of me is like, don't say that. I think it's much better to practice thinking anything your mind can do can probably figure it out. There's a way. There's probably a fucking way, but doesn't mean you'll figure out how. But understanding there's a way is much better than saying it's not possible. Okay. And where that leads to is the things we're taught, genetics. It leads me to understanding a little bit more about femininity and masculinity, right? There are things in our genetics that help with those things, with masculinity and femininity, and things that a lot more things in our environment where we're taught what are masculine and feminine traits. And even when I tell people, when I open on this podcast and I say, I create adult content for women, I could imagine the reactions of a lot of women and men who are like, instantly have a bias of, who is this man telling me that he's creating content specific for a woman, right? Where does he get off? Like, what is this toxic masculinity bullshit? Like, there's a reaction I can imagine that a lot of us get when I say that, right? And what masculine and feminine energy are, there's a big debate over this stuff. I mean, you hear a lot about it in gender roles. You hear a lot about it in like masculinity and femininity and like dominant submissiveness and like inequality. And I think all those things need to be separate, right? First, let's look at historical and how we got here, right? Well, if you think about masculine roles and feminine roles, not who's using them, just the traits, right? When it comes to masculinity, that's protector. That's a trait of a protector. That's a trait of a leader. That's the trait of someone who fixes problems. It's also staying calm when there's chaos going on, right? There's dominance, there's strength, there's confidence, right? And if you look at the traits of femininity, right? You have what's nurturing, you have compassion, you have empathy, you have being gentle, you have being a good follower, right? And you have and like when I say that, someone might be like, women can be leaders too. And what I'm saying is don't look at women. Look at these are just traits which help define what masculine is and help define what feminine is. Because when it comes to feminine, it comes to sensitive and also being very intuitive, right? And having healing energy. To me, that represents feminine traits. Now, what I'm saying is that term when mama bear has to take charge and like protect her cubs, and that's a woman who is practicing masculine traits because she doesn't have another partner to fulfill that role, right? I'm a I am a cis white male who has masculine energy by default, but that doesn't mean I can't embrace my feminine energy and feminine traits a lot of times, right? And so, a good example of that is if my little kitty hurts her leg and I have to nurse it back and go and treat it and like nurture it. What that is me as a man expressing my feminine energy, right? So it makes it, and it's funny because there's so much debate about like feminism and masculinity, and like I was watching this podcast of Jordan Peterson, who in general, a lot of he's a smart guy, but a lot of his tools don't resonate with me. So I just I ignore those tools. But some of his words do resonate, and I appreciate those tools, and I will embrace those tools, right? But this was an example of like the debate with the feminist, and he's like,
what the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines, in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power.
I think a better way of debating this shit is not to think of, a man should be X, right? A man should have masculine traits and a woman should have feminine traits, right? Like, I understand historically where that comes from, but really what we should embrace is that masculine traits are good. Feminine traits are good. It should be up to the individual how they want to embrace those traits, right? If someone wants to be extremely only masculine traits, if someone wants to be extremely feminine traits, and that serves them, let them do that. And you can have the ability to do both, right? I think instead of debating about masculine traits being negative or overpowering feminine traits, it's really much better to embrace that these traits are actually good, and it should be up to the individual and aware that the individual should be aware of what traits they are expressing, right? And what traits they want to embrace. And this can happen the way you present yourself in life. It could happen day to day. It could all flex as any way you'd like it to. Understanding how that we got there, right? Well, imagine when we're tribal people, right? These traits help us survive. It's like the codependency, cohabitating, where you're like, one person needs to fulfill these roles, the other person needs to fulfill these roles, and by separating those roles, it helps the tribe, the community, the religious group, the country survive, right? It were traits that so many different groups, ethnic groups, adhered to, that helped split the roles of the individual to help facilitate survival, right? And this is also genetics. Like I mentioned, like a woman has genetic code to help her become mother or to kick in her feminine instincts, right? More than even a man. I mean, way different than a man. Like a woman who's genetically born as a woman typically has genetically codes in her that when she gets pregnant, her instincts turn on to become more of a mother. Well, like I said before, just because that's how we're genetically programmed doesn't mean our mind has 1000x the ability to override that if we need, right? If I am a male and I want to become a mother and nurturing and raise my kids and use my entire bandwidth to do that, I might not have that genetic code written in me, but my mind is way more powerful to learn how to become the most amazing mother, if that's what I wanted to do, right? And just because I have genetics that might not help facilitate that doesn't mean I shouldn't be able, or if I wanted to, or learn how to, right? So I think it's really important, right? So when I think of the awakening and I think about 2024 becoming the reprogramming, it's good to identify the difference between how we got here historically, how we got here genetically, how we got here through tribalism, understand, oh, feminine roles are this, this, and this. Masculine roles are this, this, and this. Well, guess what? 2024 is about learning how to reprogram, right? So regardless of what history says, I have the awareness and the freedom to live any fucking way I want to tomorrow, right? I could subscribe to some of these roles. I could embrace some and reject others, but I don't have to listen to any of them. I can actually do whatever the fuck I want to tomorrow, but I might have to practice and change my brain to accomplish that, right? You just can't switch how you're programmed. You have to understand how it works and ask yourself, how do I want to live, right? And when it comes to forgetting about the past and asking ourselves, how the fuck do we want to live? Well, that brings us to our next segment, Future Class.
Future Class. I've heard of history class, and I've never heard of future class. But everything I'm gonna say is gonna be amazing.
History is a lot different than the future, right? Even when it comes to like racism and like prejudice, it's very good to understand how your mind works and how it got there. But instead of debating about like the inequalities of the past, it's probably much more effective to ask all of ourselves, how do we want to fucking live? Because I'll give you a great example. If you ask somebody who has a business, who owns a business, and you ask them, hey man, you need to put someone in charge of your business to run it because you're going to be gone for 5 years, right? Would you want the best person for the job? They would say, absolutely. What if you ask them, do they care if they're male or female? No, they don't care. They want the best person for the job. What if that person is trans? Do you care if that's... Most business owners, would say, I want the best qualified person to run my fucking business, and I don't give a shit if whatever they do, what religion they are, what race they are, as long as they are the best person for the job, right? Well, I think a lot more of us could agree on that than if we were trying to debate, hey, look at, well, that's wrong. Affirmative action's right. Affirmative action's wrong. The people who debate affirmative action, whether it's benefiting or not benefiting, that binary thinking doesn't give us any progress. If we taught a future class and said, okay, regardless, like we need to understand the past, but that's history class. But let's talk about the future class. Future class is regardless of what's happened, how do we want to live, right? Regardless, wouldn't you guys all want the most qualified person to run your business? If we're in agreement with that, why don't we focus on that? That's something we could agree to. And it's more important than worrying about what has happened, right? Is worrying about how we want to live, right? Moving forward. And I think that coincides with how do we want to reprogram our brain, right? Oh, do women traditionally have to always be the mother, right? Well, they've been the mother, and then since then, women are becoming less of a mother, and women now have to work, and the kids are like, forget. It's like I said, it's good to understand, but we also need to take future class, and we need to say, hey, regardless of where we were, how do we want to live moving forward? We can do anything we want. When you're talking about future class, that also is way more inclusive of a lot more people, right? Instead of debating whether about trans people and like if it's good or bad or like what the trends, like it's trans people are very fascinating to me. And I've been trying to understand it because I am a cis male who follows, my default is a masculine guy. I have very little attraction, even sexually, to males. But I question it constantly because I think that's extremely important, trying to understand how much of this was taught to me, how much of this is my own instincts and feeling. But what's fascinating to me about trans people is, one, their desire to change their genetics, right? Because I'm trying to understand that when I've never had that feeling, right? And also there's a lot more people wanting to be trans than there has historically. Well, the first thing I think about is okay, I think the past is a lot less relevant to the conversation of the future class in this, because my thought is, man, in future class, everyone should do whatever the fuck they want, right? We've spent so much time in history worrying about conforming to the groups for our survival, but we live in the safest time where you really only need yourself to survive. And when I'm talking about survival, I'm talking about food, shelter, water. It's almost like it's more of a given, but we live in that tribal world. So if you want to become trans, if you want to be a woman, be a man, if you want to be non-binary, if you want to fucking walk around and bark like a dog, if that are things that serve you, if it makes you empowered, if it makes you feel more like your authentic self, future class says, embrace that, man. I'm trying to figure that out myself. You do you, right? And especially that it has no effect on my life, like on who I want to be. You being who you want to be has no effect on me being who I want to be, right? Well, but it does fascinate me. It fascinates me to be like, where does this come from and why are more people doing this? And I'll give you an abstract thought, because my thought is it's almost a spiritual practice for two reasons. Becoming trans is a spiritual practice. This is just a feeling I'm having, especially it's hard to know if this is true. And I hope that some of my trans fans give me some feedback if this resonates or not. And I feel like it's a spiritual practice for two reasons. One is, this is a little abstract thought, but I'm like, maybe if we've had multiple lifetimes where we've had lifetimes where we were women, lifetimes we were men, and maybe we were more comfortable with one of those. And in this reality, you actually don't need to conform to gender roles, right? We don't need all the women to act like women and all the women to have babies and all the men to act like men, because we don't need those roles for survival anymore, even though that's how we've existed most of our life. So without needing to be a man to survive and without needing to be a woman to survive, you have the ability to be anything you want, right? So maybe you felt more comfortable as your man, and maybe you felt more comfortable as a woman in a past life, and there's something instinctual that makes you want to embrace that. And in this level of the video game, we had the ability to. You can live that way, and you have a community that supports you, right? And so maybe you just feel more manly or masculine or more feminine, or whatever that means to you, based on experiences in past lives that now make you safe to embrace, right? Because if you grew up not even that few more years ago, but imagine hundreds and thousands of years ago, if you were born as a woman and you felt like male, if you were Joan of Arc, that's one little exception, but if you were a woman that felt like a male, your community would shun you and be like, nope, you need to be a woman. We need you to stay a woman and become a woman, practice woman traits for the survival of the group, right? Well, in this level of the video game, in this level of the reality, that's not necessary anymore. So you get to embrace whoever the fuck you want, or whoever you instinctually feel like. And that's maybe why we're getting this. Maybe there's always been this many people who felt uncomfortable or felt more comfortable with the other gender, and wherever that comes from, maybe it's past lives, maybe it's other things, but we have the ability to be anyone who we want. So let's embrace that, right? The other part of this spiritual practice is removing privilege. Okay. And what privilege is basically, it's like the benefits you get based on the group you're born into. And privilege is not just male privilege and female privilege. It's also ethnic privilege, right? It's like, oh, if you're Hispanic or specifically Mexican, or if you're Russian, you automatically have a group to go to, right? If I am Russian, I can walk into the Russian community center. No one knows my personality. No one knows if I'm a good person or a bad person, but there is some level of acceptance. Oh, you're one of us, right? And privilege comes in gender, it comes in ethnicity, it comes in from what city you're in. Oh, you're from California, you're one of us. You're American, you're one of us, right? So the spiritual practice of becoming trans is almost like you are removing any privilege, all of it, from your life. And if someone is going to like you yourself, they're going to have to know you. They're going to have to get to know you, not just like, oh, you're a woman, so you are part of our group, and oh, you're a man, like, come on, you're one of us. The practice of being trans makes me feel like you are you are choosing to endure a spiritual practice of removing privilege from your life and letting the chips fall where they may, right? Allowing judgment of others to maybe come bombarding in your life. Maybe part of that spiritual practice is learning how not to be susceptible to the judgment of others, to learn that your own opinion is more important and ultimately the only opinion that matters, right? So that's what it feels like to me. And so I can easily say I'm a fucking massive feminist, right? Because you know what femininity and feminism means to me? It means supporting a woman to do whatever the fuck she wants to do, right? Like, there might be different types of femininity, but that's the only femininity for feminism that resonates with me. If you are a feminist and you're like, oh, women shouldn't be sex workers or fucking pole dancers or strippers because that gives women a bad name. It makes it like you're bringing down other women. If you shame other women, oh, you stay at home mom. Like in the 80s, mothers who stayed at home were getting shamed because they're like, oh, the new woman is the one who competes with the man in the corporate office. Well, my thought is this. If you want women to become equal to men, which I do, you support them doing whatever the fuck they choose to do for them, right? If a woman is like, I love dancing on a pole, I love the attention it brings, I love being a sex worker, other women should support her to do that. You know why? Because think about men. Guys aren't in a locker room going like, oh yeah, did you hear about Jake? Yeah, like he got a job as a garbage man, and like that's just like demasculating all of us. Like, oh, that guy's doing that. Guys never criticize another man for doing what works for him, right? And in more often you see a man supporting a man to do whatever the fuck that man wants to do, right? So I think true feminism is supporting a woman's choice to do whatever the fuck she wants to do. Just like men support other men to do whatever the fuck they want to do that works for them, right? And that also makes me not a feminist. I mean, I am a feminist. I'm a maleist. A man should also be able to do whatever the fuck he wants. Like, and this is a side note. It's like, I have done sex work. I participate in sex work. I have, and when I'm making adult content, that's actually sex work, right? Well, there's a lot of men that look down upon sex workers or escorts, and I think to myself, I'm like, if I ask most dudes, like, hey man, can you imagine, like, right, if women were paying you to have sex with them, is that something you would enjoy? A lot of men would say, well, if women were paying me to have sex with them, yeah, I would enjoy that. Okay. Why on God's green earth would you not think a woman has the capacity to enjoy it too, right? How is this spiritual being that much different from me, right? So I think of myself as a feminist, I think of myself as a maleist, and I think of myself as a spiritualist, where it's like, if you're a spiritual being, I actually don't give a shit about your race. I don't give a shit about your gender. I don't give a shit about your traditions. The most important thing I care about is how you treat me and how you respect me and how you treat the people around you, right? That is the spiritualist. That is the future class saying, you know, people's tribal groups are the worst way to define how they are, how their character is. A better representation of learning about individuals' characters is watching them treat you and watching them treat others. You're going to learn way more from that than trying to connect the dots of similarities of past ethnicities and ethnic groups or gender roles, right? But that is also part of reprogramming, realizing that you can't guess. You can't say, oh, because they're from that group, they think this way. Because they're from that group, they act this way, right? Like maybe we had to do that in the past, but now that's a poor indicator. And actually, you're better off just having a conversation with them and you learn a lot. Part of reprogramming my mind is also embracing both feminine traits, both masculine traits, understand when they serve me, right? If I need to have compassion and exercise my femininity through compassion and empathy and caring, I need to do that. I should feel comfortable doing that. If I need to exercise my dominance and protection over the people around me and my assertiveness and embrace that masculine energy, I can do that, right? I can do that in real time. I can do that regardless of how I was genetically coded. I can do that regardless of how I've been taught. It's more about how I want to think. And when it comes to learning how to practice, play, and experiment with your feminine energy and masculine energy, intimacy provides a safe place to do that. And that leads us to the segment we call Intimacy Coaching Tips.
Ooh, baby, don't you worry. It's just the tips. Intimacy Coaching Tips.
So when it comes to sex and intimacy, intimacy provides a safe place to practice and experiment with your feminine energy and masculine energy, right? Because what intimacy does is it provides you a place to not feel embarrassed or not feel shameful, or if you mess up or do something that you aren't comfortable with or the other person's not comfortable with. When you share intimacy, it provides a safe place to play, right? So, and imagine when you're role playing, right? If you're role playing a teacher and a student, and if one day I'm the student and she's the teacher, or the next day I'm the teacher and she's the student, those different roles require different types of masculine and feminine energy, and it allows you to play and experiment with those, right? If one day you're going to be the dominant one in bed and she's a submissive, or if the next day I'm going to be dominated by my partner, you're using different feminine and masculine energies when you're in those roles. And the limit is really up to what your imagination and your comfortability practicing and in playing with your partner. And when you do that, it helps you embrace and connect with those energies more. When it comes to what a lot of people in the sex positive community will learn is that you get to try out these things, right? And in the sex positive community, it could be you get to play safely with other people, and you could be like, I want to exercise masculinity and I want you to exercise masculinity, or I want to exercise femininity and I want you to exercise masculinity, right? And I think about it too when it comes to like dominance and submission. You know, some people don't like the idea of, oh, women aren't supposed to be submissive and they're equal to men. Well, there's a difference between equality, right? Feminism are just traits. Masculinity are just traits. As a genetic woman and genetic man, you get to use those traits at will, right? And so just because something is submissive doesn't mean you're a woman and you have to be submissive. No. If you want, regardless if you're a man or woman, you have the option of being submissive. And maybe submissive is feminine, but that doesn't mean you can't be masculine. It doesn't mean you can't try to be masculine. And it doesn't matter what you're actually genetically coded to do beforehand, right? You can be non-binary, you can be extremely masculine, extremely feminine, and you can exercise the very opposite roles of what you are even in day-to-day life. So in the sex positive community, you can find a lot of people who switch, right, roles from their normal life, right? So a lot of times you will see people who are leaders and they want to play and feel what it's like to be submissive, right? And so you'll have people who like giving up control. Maybe their life is so much of needing to be in control that when it comes to the playground of sexuality and sex positivity, they want to give up control. When you look in the world of BDSM, the reason why it's such a mental benefit to so many is if your life is constantly worrying or thinking of all these different scenarios and you have to be a leader and you're in control and you have all these different possibilities of your mind constantly being on, way to give your mind a break. And sometimes that evolves where, imagine you are bound, you're tied up, your entire body can't move. Imagine you have a blindfold on. Imagine you have something covering your mouth, right? Imagine you're suspended in the air, right? You remove all those senses and you completely become powerless, right? And that role empowers you to give up control and give your mind a break from feeling like it needs to be in control, right? So in the world of sexuality, it's a great place to play with all these things, right? There's a lot of straight men who really enjoy a woman getting a strap on and fucking them, right? They really get a physical and mental benefit from it. So the world of sexuality is a great playground, and it has nothing to do with how you want to be in everyday life. It's almost a separate thing, right? That's when I come and I say, when I'm trying to make adult content for women, I'm trying to do it in a completely different way, because I want to use my own feminine energy, my feminine energy, to create the fantasy for other feminine energy, right? As if I want it for me. And I think that looks much more different than the traditional adult content you see out there now, which in my perspective is masculine energy fantasizing about feminine energy, and masculine energy fantasizes about other masculine energy as well. And so when 2023 was mentioned by a lot as the awakening and really the awareness, I also think it's really important to understand that continues. Your awareness will continue. It's not like the Matrix where you're just like, oh, here's everything and now you know everything. No. You have to slowly become more and more aware. So in 2024, I think it's a good idea to learn to question everything. And if I had a child, one of the things I would try to get him to do is learn how to question everything, which leads us to our next segment called Uncle Grant's Parenting Advice.
Why you got it all wrong?
Because you're doing it all wrong.
No, you got it all wrong.
See, there you have it. You're doing it all wrong.
But Dad, you're doing it wrong. Mommy doesn't do it like this.
Now, I am Uncle Grant. I have no kids of my own, but I have 2 cats and kitties and a dog, and I have great parenting advice to give to you parents. So the first thing I got to do is tell you, stop telling your kids to eat all the shit on their plate, or take 2 more bites before you get up, or the classic line from the Pink Floyd album, how can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat, right? Like, I think all of us have heard that when we were growing up over and over again, right? But before I explain why you should never tell your kids that, so first let me tell you the goals I would have for my kid. One of the goals I would have for my kid is teaching him to question everything. That is some of the goals I have for myself, right? Question everything, even the things that you have no reason to question. And one of the things is really hard to become aware about are things that you don't have a reason to question, right? So I call this the Santa Claus effect. And these are things, so these is something you probably identify with. A lot of times as you grow up, you may model your parents in some things, but then, or be completely opposite to what they've modeled. as you grow up and choose. Because I give you examples, you're like, oh, my mother was a very charismatic and very optimistic person. And a lot of my traits follow that, right? So I liked that trait in her. I saw that as a kid and I'm like, I like what I see. And so I'm going to mirror it. And you might have a parent say that was messy and you're like, I never liked the feeling of being messy and that never bothered them. It bothered me. So I became a cleaner person, say, than the model. Well, the Santa Claus effect has nothing to do with either of those. The Santa Claus effect is when you've never actually had a reason to question it. It never became like, oh, I feel uncomfortable or this makes me feel good. It's more like it's just been taught and no one has ever thought to question it because you never had a reason to, right? So I call it the Santa Claus effect because, if you are a parent and you are like, oh, we're going to have a baby, and then imagine your partner, if you have one partner to raise that, traditionally is you might ask them, maybe you don't even talk about it until they start to become like 2, and you're like, do we teach our kids Santa Claus? And assuming no one had a traumatic, like my parents never told us Santa Claus, like if you didn't really have any trauma, positive or negative or positive with Santa Claus, you're going to actually just do what was done to you. So if you're like, Santa Claus, take it or leave it, I have no positive or negative effects, you're going to mirror exactly what was done to you. And another few examples of this, which I can point out, are you ever hear people like, I'm thinking of how many parents out there tonight will be like, tell their kid, you need to finish everything on your plate before you leave the table, before you play video games, before you do anything, right? Well, if you think about where that comes from, it makes sense. Probably since humans could communicate, they probably said, most of our existence was like, you as a child need to eat everything on your plate because we don't know when the next food's going to be here. We don't know if we will have enough food for tomorrow, right? And if you don't, you as a child may have a lesser chance of survival, right? Well, 1/3 of children are obese, and there is a huge weight problem and health problem from eating too much. Food is abundant. It is everywhere. It is calorically rich. We don't really worry about the scarcity of food, but we still teach our kids as if we do, right? We teach our kids like there's no benefit. Like imagine all of us, like most of our resolutions, a lot of them are about health and diet, health and diet, right? And imagine we're teaching our children, hey, I know your body is telling your brain that you don't want to eat anymore. I know your mind is saying I'm full, but we want you to ignore those things and force your mind and body to stuff itself more, expanding your stomach and making you have the habit of eating more food, right? No one ever asks, maybe we shouldn't tell our kids to finish everything on their plate, right? Maybe we should we would never tell an adult that. So why would we tell a kid that? Again, if you never had a reason to question it, you will just model it, right? Another example of this is circumcision, okay? And I was listening to a podcast called Flightless Bird, who's done by this documentarian journalist from New Zealand called David Ferrier, who's an excellent writer because he's just really good at pointing out the humor and absurdities in his writing. And what this podcast is about is he's looking at all these things Americans do that we think are normal, but the rest of the world doesn't really do. And it kind of is a good way to help you learn to question everything, right? And he looks at circumcision, and I had to ask myself, I didn't have any idea, but growing up, you know, whether you see a lot of naked men in the locker room or in high school or whatever, but most people are circumcised, right? It was rare that I would see anybody uncircumcised. Well, I thought that's how the world was, right? I'm like, most people are circumcised. I know Christians do it. I knew Jews do it. But in reality, most of the world is not circumcised, right? And 70 to 90% of men in America are circumcised. But we don't even question that, right? And really what happens is, why do we do it? Because no one really created an issue with it one way or the other. It might be very specific. A few people might be like, I don't like that I'm circumcised, so I'm not going to do it to my children. But most of us, kind of like Santa Claus, are like, oh, we're having a baby. Doctor asks, do you want him circumcised? I've never had an issue one way or the other. And you know what the normal response from a doctor is? Do whatever the father is, right? If the father's uncircumcised, leave him uncircumcised. If the father's circumcised, circumcise him. And that's what we fucking do, right?
Seriously, you should have that taken care of. I mean, you're a very attractive man, but that penis is a disaster.
Well, what would you have me do, Jay?
Get circumcised.
Growing up in New Zealand, it was always sort of weird watching American TV shows, where it was just a given that every adult man would be circumcised. I understand why it's probably better to circumcise an infant than an adult, but why do it at all? At least 70% of the American male population is circumcised, about 115 million men. That's giant. Why chop off 115 million foreskins?
There are a couple of factors. The first one is you want the child to look like daddy. So if dad's circumcised, the kid's circumcised. And adhesions, where the foreskin doesn't get pulled back and then it starts to stick. And phimosis, where you get scars and you can't retract it.
But when you start to really question this, what the fuck is circumcision is actually male genital mutilation, right? It is cutting a piece off the penis that is completely natural and that has been there most of our existence for 200,000 years as a human species. No other animal does that, right? And then even when you're not religious, you might ask a doctor what benefits and might say like, oh, they don't want them to be made fun of because everybody else is getting genitally mutilated. So you don't want them to get made fun of. Let's genitally mutilate your child because we don't want them to get made fun of in the locker room. Well, the other thing I ask is, well, what's the benefit? Like, they cut off a tip of the penis that has some of the most nerve endings in the penis, right? Well, that is going to make sex feel less good. And if you look at the history of where circumcision comes from, it is actually to reduce people's desire to masturbate and have sex, right?
I'm not talking about the reasons we're told today. I'm talking about diving back into the 1800s.
Circumcision began being promoted by doctors, aside from it having a religious ritual history among Muslims and Jews and some tribes around the world. In the Victorian era, the belief was that sex was wrong, sex was dirty and only to be undertaken for procreation, that masturbation was a sin or dangerous because it dissipated the body's energies. And it was thought that if you cut off a boy's foreskin, it would hurt to masturbate. And it would also make him less likely to indulge in sex. And actually, a philosopher and physician Maimonides in the 13th century said the same thing. He said the foreskin is a source of pleasure, and removing it meant a boy would spend more time in his studies. So this has an old history.
That's where it came from. That's probably where it came in this patriarchal bullshit of like, hey, we need people to have less sex. So if we use this practice of removing the pleasures of sex, both it's what female mutilation, we've all heard of that because it was practiced by only a few tribes compared to the rest of the world, and we think that's horrible, and we're like, they genetically mutilate a woman to desensitize her to the pleasures of sex. Well, male circumcision is done for that exact same reason. It's just that everybody's been doing it, so we don't even question if we should, right? And even now, I'm like, if I had a child, I would be like, don't circumcise him. Why? Because he's going to enjoy sex more if he's not circumcised. And I would want that for him. I wish I didn't get circumcised so I can enjoy sex more, right? So it's just a good representation of the Santa Claus effect, of how there are so many things in our world that we just do and not really even question if we should or not. And if you haven't thought about circumcision being an issue, or is that even matter? Why doesn't it matter? Well, if it's always done when you're an infant, or most of the time when you're an infant, there's going to be little ability to compare if it's less pleasurable, more pleasurable, if it's indifferent. And also, what's the reason we do it, right? What is the purpose? And even doing it, if the tools of religion, of being Judaism and Christianity, serve you, embrace them. And if you want to do that to uphold those values that benefit your life, I think you're more enlightened than most of the fucking people who just do it because that's what the doctor says, is do whatever you do, and not question, well, how might this benefit my child and how might this not? And what are things we don't know, right? Doctors won't talk about the pleasure of sex and how it affects the pleasure of sex. I hope it's a good example of just starting to question everything, not just the things that make you uncomfortable, just not the things that like pop up in your life, but start to question everything, and part of my journey, I learned one of those things was just monogamy, right? You grow up being like, we're monogamous because that's how everybody is. That's how everything is, right? But you ask yourself, why? Where does that come from? How come everybody says they want to be monogamous, but if you look, they're really bad at practicing it, right? Like, infidelity comes from people saying, I was taught to be monogamous, but I still have urges that say maybe I'm not supposed to be monogamous, right? And even knowing that, you should question it, right? Another is social shame, right? If I have shame, like I mentioned before, shame of nudity, right? That is 100% taught. We naturally have no shame to be naked. We would be the only animal that has a shame to feel naked, and that when it gets born is taught that they are supposed to put clothes on because they're not supposed to be seen naked, right? So learning to question all these things, where they come from, and what do I value? There's no more tribe. There's no more conformity. There's no more reasons to need to conform. And if I don't do it, they're going to kick me out and I might die, right? We are also wired to want to conform. It makes sense. When we were tribal, conformity was a tool for survival. So it makes sense that you want to follow the norms. It makes sense that you're susceptible to judgment of the people around you. But in this reality, in this level of the video game, you don't need other people's judgment to survive. All you need is your own. When this level of the video game is learning how to become your authentic self, you are safe to do so. You get to remove yourself from whatever fucking family you had. If that serves you, you are able to find your own chosen family that supports the reprogramming you want to do to your own mind, right? I'm going to use this analogy and kind of close the show with this a lot, because I'll recap a lot of the things we talked about in the alternative reality.
Survival and reproduction. For most of human existence, the game of life was a daily struggle to hunt and gather and not overeat the minimal food reserves, and not overpopulate as resources were always scarce. In our reality, about 10,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. An agrarian method of farming and raising livestock made food abundant. Minimal food reserves were no more. The need to not overeat our food reserves was no longer. Food had become abundant. In the alternative reality, this did not happen. Anthropologists suggest the first attempts at agrarian society were rejected from insect infestations, sickness, and death. So the world remained as hunters and gatherers, and food reserves were constantly minimal. That was until 1950, when scientists created the first pest control pill that allowed farming and agrarian methods. So in the alternative reality, food has only been abundant for the last 75 years. It is here in 2024 where we meet Grant Rosenquist and his attempt to teach the perspective on modern-day gastronomy.
All right, now it's time for where we recap the podcast about food positivity. And again, I want to share food with more people. I want to encourage the people around me and the world to be sharing food with more people. And when you take the concepts of consent and transparency, that allows us to start doing that, right? And, what did we learn today? We learned when it comes to food porn for women, it's really unfortunate that so much of it is made from the perspective of a male, right? Because in the old times, nobody was supposed to be sharing food except for their married partner. But in the subculture of 2024, there's this level of where men are okay to share food with more women, but it's super shamed that women are sharing food with men, right? And I think our food porn is representing that, right? So when I'm going to create food porn for women, I'm going to do it from my feminine energy to try to produce more nuanced food porn to also hopefully encourage women not to be shameful about sharing, right? What else did we learn today? And if you are a man who wants more food sharing in his life, you need to encourage women to be sharing more food with more people, right? And women also need to be encouraging men and women to be sharing food with more people, right? We're not going to get very far if men are like, I want lots of flavors of cakes, but I'm going to shame all the women for making it, or don't make it for others. Like, that won't work. And if you're a woman, you should be supporting a woman to do whatever she wants. If she wants to share food with tons of men, you as a woman should support her doing whatever she thinks is going to make her happy. And if she doesn't want to share food with anybody and take a vow of celibacy and poverty to not only share food with herself, if that's going to serve her, men, women, we should all be supporting whatever a woman wants to do, right? And if we don't, if women are shaming other women, that's definitely toxic food femininity, right? Because men don't shame other men for sharing food, and let's also remember to question everything, right? Like, if an alien came down, and talked to me and said, okay, we're anthropologist aliens and we're watching you little monkeys on Earth. Grant, why is the tip of your tongue cut off? I'd be like, I don't know. Doctor said to my dad, well, your tongue's cut off. You should cut his tongue off. It's the anthropologist, well, why cut your tongue off at all? And then if you look back to Victorian era or further, they're like, well, we need to make sure people don't overeat the food reserves. So what if we cut off the tips of their tongue to bland the food a little bit? Because if food tastes good, that creates temptation, and temptation will creates ability for people to overeat the food reserves. So let's create a practice of cutting the tips off of everyone's tongue when they're a baby to hopefully bland food so they're less tempted to overeat the food supplies, right? Well, that might have made sense back then, but it makes no fucking sense why we're still cutting the tips of our tongues off when we should be enjoying food more. We should be sharing it more, right? If I had a child, I would be like, don't fucking cut the tip of his tongue off. I want him to enjoy food. I want him to enjoy sharing it with more people, right? So let's stop that practice unless you are aware of it and it serves you. If you are religious and you are devout or you're Orthodox and you're like, there's a value I see to cutting off the tip of my tongue, then brother, sister, embrace that shit. But if you have no idea why the fuck you're cutting off the tip of your tongue, you're going to not want to, because it will help you enjoy indulging in the abundance of food we have, right? I'm going to tell you some crazy things. Like, I create this podcast because I'm trying to teach people all these fucking constructs that tell us food is bad, too many people sharing food. They existed because just until 75 years ago, if people overate the food reserves, it could threaten society. But food is abundant, right? Now, imagine a future, right? Imagine a future where everyone is sharing food. Imagine a future that food porn no longer exists, right? Everybody watches food porn, 100 million visits a day. More people visit Food Hub every day than visit Amazon, okay? But imagine a day when food porn doesn't exist, right? Why? Because everybody lives like food porn stars. Everybody is sharing food with each other. Every day, people are eating 3 times a day. Not once with themselves or their partner, 3 times a day with sometimes people from work, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers. Sometimes people are just fucking buying food from a stranger. Sometimes people are making food and selling it to a stranger. Here's what you won't believe. In that future, not only is porn gone, people will be sharing so much food that they will have to make New Year's resolutions to slow their intake of sharing all these cuisines, because guess what? They are overweight, right? In our reality, when I'm only eating myself or with my committed partner, and then sometimes that stops, we have a hard time getting to normal weight. Everyone's underweight. But in the future, people are sharing so much food that half the country is overweight. Now, I know that sounds crazy, and I know that makes no sense to where you are right now. But in that future, people don't tie sharing food to relationships because it's so abundant, right? It's the need to not overeat the food reserves are no longer. So people are sharing food for the enjoyment of sharing it with each other. They try to make it taste better, right? If you share food in the future with someone else that is encouraged by your partner, right? They're like, oh, I'm going to not be home tonight. So who are you going to share food with? It's not like a world where they're only expected to share food with one person, right? Well, I know that sounds bizarre, but in the future, that will happen. And hopefully this podcast will help us get there a little faster. All right, that is all the time we have for on this episode of My Sexy Self-Care. Just a reminder, this podcast is my art, and the only audience I make this for is me. But if it brings you joy too, that brings me added joy. And if you want to share the message of sex positivity, I appreciate it if you like, subscribed, and shared this podcast with someone who also might enjoy it. If you have a question that you want discussed on the show, or if you have an interesting story and are wanting to be interviewed or create content with, write us at mysexyselfcare@gmail.com. And like always, don't take yourself too seriously. And remember, life is supposed to be fun. And I'm telling you this because I'm really telling me this. Now here it is, your daily dose of Dharma.
When I was a kid, if you didn't finish your supper, as we called it.
Supper, yeah.
Yeah, my mother was just like, well, you're going to finish, she would just wrap it in cellophane and you just picked up where you left off for breakfast. Well, the next morning, I remember we were having waffles. My mother always made Sunday breakfast. So we had all these waffles, eggs, bacon, this whole layout. My brother was looking at half-eaten cube steaks and a little mound of green bean casserole. And he goes, so he looked at my mom, he goes, Mom, can I have a waffle? And she goes, no, you got to finish your supper. He's like, well, after I finish my supper, then can I have a waffle? She goes, no, that is your breakfast. And he goes, oh, Mom, I hate you. And my dad, without looking up, took a full glass of milk and threw it in his face. No, but it was kind of funny. We know what's hilarious was my mother just popped up and just immediately started cleaning up, and my dad just kept eating. Like he didn't like the roles were defined back then. Now the guy has to throw the milk, he has to clean it up while telling his wife she's brave.
Sexy self-care, sexy self-care.